CharityVillage Connects. Today we're talking about the urgent need for the nonprofit sector to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into its operations, leadership, and workplace. Joining me today is Jade Pichette. Jade serves as the Director of Programs at Pride at Work Canada, where they work with over 250 large employers across Canada around gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation inclusion. Jade has been named one of Future of Good's 2022 Young Impact Leaders and one of Toronto Metropolitan University's 2021 Pride Champions. Welcome, Jade.
Thank you, Mary. Happy to be here.
Well, I think we should start with a pulse check. With the recent tragic events in Colorado making headlines around the world, it's clear that creating a safe space for the 2S LGBTQIA+ community is more critical than ever. Can you give us a broader perspective on what you've seen during the pandemic? First of all, and then I'd like to sort of focus a bit closer on the nonprofit sector in Canada. So what have you seen?
Well, certainly, with the tragic shooting in Colorado, which, as should be mentioned, what happened at a LGBTQ venue after a drag queen story hour was announced on the weekend of the Trans Day of Remembrance, where we honor our dead. As for myself, as a trans person who's been out for 2 decades, and which is very rare for most trans people have not been out that long. It's something that we see as a consistent and ongoing challenge. I think we've gotten to this place where, because there is legal rights, at least here in Canada, because that is not necessarily true on a global basis by any means. In fact, in some places, explicitly, our identities are still criminalized, including by death penalty. These issues are things that we sometimes think are part of the past, is part of our history instead of part of our present. But the reality is that over the pandemic, hate crimes have risen in Canada significantly against 2S LGBTQIA+ communities. And it's really hard to see any queer trans person in public life who is not being attacked in some capacity. In fact, it just earlier today, Faye Johnson just got flooded, who's the head of executive director of Wisdom to Action, by a number of hate messages. I myself made a post last week, just got flooded with hate messages. And this is not that uncommon. Every queer organization I know constantly has to, screen their social media for death threats, for hate speech. And that's something that we just have to deal with in our daily lives. And so it's something that, as a society, we have thought is in the past, but in practice is actually increasing and rising in terms of the amount of violence against our communities.
That is just horrible news. What do you think is causing this increase that you've seen, especially during the pandemic? Is it political? Is it influences in the United States? What do you think is causing it?
So with a lot of political movements, I started in poli-sci before moving over to social work and becoming a social worker. And, it's really interesting always to look at how people who want to have power will use hatred against a marginalized group. And that's what we're seeing with trans communities right now. It's difficult to have the same level of open hatred as there used to be in some capacities. But we become a wedge issue, and we become a wedge issue that distracts people from other things that are happening in society, like the fact that, we have very significant inflation, that people are struggling to be able to, house themselves, to feed themselves. Homelessness, or I should say houselessness, is on the rise. And so because of these many issues, is that trans folks in particular, but not only trans folks, of course, but especially trans folks, can be used as this wedge issue, as if we're somehow harming children, that we're doing all these terrible things, that we're harming women. And that's, I mean, there's no factual evidence for any of this. But just like we've seen historically, going back to even the Middle Ages, I'm going to go history geek on you. We have seen these consistent historical uses of violence against a community to distract from especially economic issues. And so we're seeing this in the US, and part of it is that we actually made a lot of progress over the 2010s. So part of it is also this like backlash that's happening against our communities. I mean, women, and when the different waves of feminist movements started to make progress and made actual, legislative and political changes, saw backlash. When Black civil rights movements did the same, they also saw backlash. This is something that commonly happens when there is this feeling by a empowered majority that there is somehow something being taken away from them. And this is actually being weaponized on social media, in other forms of media, especially as we all become a bit more disconnected from one another, and fall into the algorithms that are pushing people towards white supremacy, anti-trans, anti-queer violence, and more.
So in terms of, I mean, we've seen a lot of attention, especially in the nonprofit sector, in the last couple of years in particular, where there's been a real movement in the DEI space. And a lot of organizations are investing in finding out ways to do a better job. I mean, certainly we know that, it isn't solved, but there seems to be a lot of effort in place in the nonprofit sector. But what are you seeing? I'm curious. You work with large organizations. What are you seeing? Has there been an increase in nonprofit organizations trying to do a better job of being inclusive and making a safe place for their employees and the people that volunteer for them? Or, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I think in terms of the nonprofit sector, it has been mixed, right? And although I do work a lot with the corporate sector and large employers now, I'm a career nonprofit person. This is my career. This is my industry that I stick in, and I've seen how we were getting this inch. We're inching towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're starting to gain some steam over the 2010s. And then we hit the 2020s and the pandemic hit. And 90% of charities and nonprofits in Canada had a negative impact on their bottom lines. And so we're lucky in that we're not one of those organizations. We actually grew during the pandemic. And I know some other organizations who are in similar spots, but many had to shrink, many had to cut jobs, many had to do a lot of these things. And quite often what happens in those cases is the first people to go are the folks who are the most junior, who are often those who are more marginalized, who are often the equity hires, who are often the people who are diversifying the organization in different ways. And so on merely a people level, we saw this absolute impact on equity deserving communities in accessing consistent employment in the nonprofit sector. And so this is a real concern, right? So it's not just a concern of, how are we going to continue to have enough workers? It's also a concern of this is affecting the diversity of our organization. And so as a result, although I've seen more tokenistic discussions of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the nonprofit space, in terms of measurable impact, we've taken a step back over the pandemic. And that doesn't mean that we can't take a couple steps forward again, especially as we continue to, adjust to what has happened over the past few years, and move into this next phase. But that is a real concern that I see in terms of like measurable impact. And I know there's been some studies, for instance, on 2S LGBTQI plus communities, and we have been found to have been more economically impacted by the pandemic than any others. And many of us work in the nonprofit sector. Most queer and trans folks work in small and medium-sized employers, or a lot of us work in nonprofit. And it's something that is impacting the community as a whole. So unless we address those factors and the factors of seeing like not support for staff in the consistent work and ongoing work, and even just getting outside of this contract world, because there's no diversity and equity inclusion there's no inclusion or equity in contracts. There is inclusion and equity in full-time permanent employment, or by that person's choice, part-time permanent employment. And so I'm seeing some of those real impacts. So we're talking about the issues more, but what is the actual impact on real change within the industry? And I have seen the steps go backwards, which I hate to say that to be the case, because I do think we're talking about it more, but the measurable impacts are what matter.
I agree. And that's really distressing news for sure. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of workplace challenges that are specifically facing this community, so that we have a better understanding?
So it really depends within the community itself, right? And I think sometimes we look at 2S LGBTQIA plus communities as if we are this totalitarian whole. And in reality, we're one of the most diverse communities that's out there, right? And so within the community, we see hierarchies within it as well, and that impacts the workplace. So that includes around sexual orientation and gender. So, heterosexual men make a more than obviously any other gender or sexual orientation. And bisexual women actually make the least. They make it less than half in Canada of what heterosexual men make. They make less than lesbians. They make less than straight women. Bisexual men make less than even lesbian women do. So we're seeing bisexual folks are overwhelmingly impacted in terms of the economics of lower paying jobs that they're provided or offered, constant discrimination within the workplace around biphobia, despite the fact that there are no real programs focused on bisexuality. There are plenty of programs out there, but very few are focused explicitly on bi communities, despite being the largest section of the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. We're also seeing, obviously, for trans folks, continued underemployment and unemployment, as well as being low income. So trans people in Canada are 5 times more likely to be below the low income cutoff in Canada than straight or just cis people in general. So cisgender being people who are identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. And so for trans people, we really see this impact on every part of their employment journey, being consistently told they're just not the right fit. And I've heard similar things from Black and Indigenous communities of being told these things, as well as autistic communities and some other disability communities. And so we really see this like constant discrimination on a daily basis, whether it's access to washrooms, which is always the thing that people seem to talk about, but it's the concrete things. It's access to benefits, not having the same access to benefits in most benefit programs in Canada currently. Workplace benefits programs don't have gender affirming care. We see the impact of people not being able to get access to their gender affirming care that is even provided by the government, even though what's provided by the government across Canada is completely variable. Some some territories like Yukon are doing really, really well. Provinces like BC, while as others are doing really, really poorly, like Northwest Territories and Quebec. And so even just getting access to those services that are provided in gender affirming care, then you're not able to take the time off work because you're not provided any of those types of benefits. And it's an actual real equity issue where we're seeing people get essentially less benefits because of their identity. We also see just violence that people are experiencing in their daily lives and the impact that can have. Like this week that we're recording this is the week just after the shooting in Colorado, and the community is not okay. And it's the time to check in with your employees because we're not okay as a community. And this has been true when there's been other major hate crimes against our communities before. But those are more frequent than people realize. Not every hate crime hits the media. The amount of trans women, even in Toronto, who have been murdered is something that people don't know or talk about, and so even just walking into the workplace, we're often more likely to have experiences of post-traumatic stress. We're more likely to have experiences of other forms of disability. And this impacts our ability to even get in the door sometimes.
Well, I think I'd like to know, since there has been more talk about it, more attention anyway in the nonprofit sector. I wonder if you could give us your perspective on where nonprofits should start in terms of creating safer and healthier workplaces for 2S LGBTQIA plus their staff and their volunteers, and how do they get started? If they're in that space where it's come to their attention how critical it is for them to change their organization, what do you advise them?
So the first thing that people usually go towards is training. However, that wouldn't be my advice. My advice is really that training is something that happens later on in a journey. And really you need to start with, where are people at in your organization right now? So don't look at what are we going to do? What are we going to teach people yet? Start with, where are people at, and get that kind of employee pulse check, and really kind of have that connection, and hear where people, how people experience their space. But it's also important that for many of us, we're in smaller nonprofits, that it's kind of easy to know if there's one person who responds to a survey who's trans, you probably know who they are in the office, right? And so making sure that the responses and the feedback that you do get is anonymized, uses a third party, some form of evaluation that is external, so that people in the organization actually have that sense of safety. And then once you do that, make sure that the people in the organization get that information back as well. They get a summary so that everybody within the organization, not just the board and the executive director, has access to that, provide transparency. And then say, okay, so we know we're not doing well in these areas. What do we need to do as a whole? And usually you need an outside consultant to do some of that support, whether that's an organization like Credit Work Canada, who's also a nonprofit, or whether that's an organization like Wisdom to Action, or Transfocus Consulting, or Bacau Consulting, both of which are out in BC, as well as many others. And really try to look at, how are we going to do this in a big picture, and create that big picture plan. And recognize that if you're making a plan without looking also at things like anti-indigeneity, racism, ableism, you're probably not going to be able to represent the community as a whole and support the community as a whole unless those are pieces of that broader plan. Once you have the plan, look at your policies, procedures, practices, work on those pieces, work on the big picture. And then once you have those, you can go towards training and create kind of that more direct, inclusive space. But always be aware that training can backfire, especially against your equity deserving staff. And that if they want to step out from that, they should be able to and have a more welcoming space that's for them, and not just be in a place where they end up having to educate their coworkers. So really, it's important that you kind of have this like overarching vision and journey. But if there's that one thing that you need to start with, it's where are we at right now? And being transparent and honest about that, and getting a third party to help you.
That's excellent advice. What are some of the tools and resources that might be available to support nonprofits in this area? Does Pride at Work have these sorts of resources to offer? Where would you go if you were a nonprofit leader, perhaps of a small to medium-sized one? Because of course they have so much fewer resources and are challenged in many ways that the larger nonprofits and charities are.
Yeah. And as somebody who's worked consistently in small nonprofits, at 17 people, this seems huge to me. It's I think something that often we are so busy that it's hard to get some of that help. But some of the places that you can get it, so we certainly have resources on Pride at Work Canada's website. So we have certain things that are publicly available that aren't through our membership program. So those are things like our resources around hiring, around most recently the experiences of 2S LGBTQIA plus folks in Canada, as well as trans inclusion resources and others. There's also really great organizations, community organizations. I'm always in belief of partnership. We have over 65 different organizations as part of our community partner network who get access to our programming. So if you are a organization that's focused on equitable groups in employment, or are 2S LGBTQI plus or Indigenous nonprofit, then they get access to our webinars for free. However, we have things like our public panel that we did with Mentor Canada around mentorship earlier this year. We have networking events for women, non-binary, trans, and agender leaders that are open to public, as well as public events through the year as well. So there certainly are resources that are available, but that community partner network, as I was mentioning, there's so many great organizations out there. And in basically every major city, there is a queer community organization that is also a nonprofit, that's also small, who's trying to do the work, who often has some of those community supports. And sometimes it's just starting by having a conversation and building a relationship and saying, where can we go from here? If in Toronto, certainly we have the 519. Ottawa has Kind Space. There's great organizations like NSRAP and the Youth Project out in Nova Scotia, Center for Sexuality in Calgary, Rainbow Resource Center in Winnipeg, UR Pride in Regina, Community in Vancouver, and many, many more. And so those are the places that I would really go, because the important thing when it comes to being welcoming to community is being in touch and being part of community.
And what about any tips for, or even strategies for individuals who, not just leaders of organizations, but anybody, people in your workplace who want to become stronger allies or agents of change within their organizations? What advice do you have to give to them so that they can lend their support?
So the first thing I would say is rethink your idea of allyship. Because quite often we talk about allyship and we talk about being an ally, and I remember when we first kind of started talking about it very actively in the early 2000s in regards to the community, and ally buttons were starting to pick up and the like. And at the time, it felt very radical. Now, it's used as a buzzword and often centers the person themselves instead of centering the community that we're talking about. So the first thing that I would say is rethink that idea, and rethink that idea from the perspective of what is my privilege, not am I an ally. So what is my privilege? Think about that piece, try and unpack some of that piece, and then from there, go and find some community-based education for yourself. So whether that's going to Glad Day Bookshop or Little Sisters in Vancouver, or other community-based bookstores or community groups. There's always public events that are low cost or free that you can go to and just be there, just be in space, learn, pick it up, be aware, and then start to engage. Once you've done a bit of that education, don't get stuck at a book. Don't get stuck in a book. I think sometimes, especially as white folks, we like to think that if we have a book club, we've made a difference. And really, we don't need to get stuck on that book, right? Like, that book is important, learning is important, but then we have to go into action. And there's two main ways that I see action when it comes to allyship, which is intervention, which is situations where you see there's harm happening. So if you're in public, for instance, and you see violence happening against somebody, going and sitting with that person, don't make it all about yourself and get upfront with that person, the person who's being not great, or terrible as the case may be, but instead go and sit with the person that is being harmed and say, they're a real jerk, aren't they? And just try and, make that connection in that moment. It could be looking at policy. You're looking at policy and you intervene in that moment because you say that, oh, no, this is not going to be inclusive to members of the community. You take those small moments to intervene, even if you're not sure about the larger impact. It's about that small moment and building those small moments. So if you have a friend who misgenders somebody or a colleague who misgenders somebody, gently correcting them, especially if it's not in front of the entire room, providing those spaces. But then you also need to advocate. And so intervention is reactive, it's in the moment. Advocacy is proactive, right? Advocacy says, okay, we need to start looking at our policies and making that encouragement, being there to be the person that goes with somebody to HR, to assuming they have an HR department, which many small nonprofits don't, but the person, their supervisor, or whoever that might be, be able to be that advocate for them, and not speak on people's behalf, but speak with them, and be able to do that. And so that includes moments where they're there. That includes moments when nobody else who is queer or trans is in the room. It's really about all of those moments and trying to find those entry points. I like to say that with any project in the nonprofit space, you can always stop, take a moment, and say, how could we make this project more inclusive? And taking that moment, which often we don't do because we're so busy, we're so overworked, many of us are, taking that moment makes all the difference, because then we're able to make those changes. So, in other words, take a moment to reflect, take a moment to educate yourself, intervene, and then advocate.
Well, fantastic words of advice. And Jade, thank you for your wisdom and your generosity, insight, and your advice. It's extremely valuable to our audience of nonprofit professionals. And I certainly hope that the next time we speak, that you've seen some positive change in the nonprofit sector, because it's sorely needed. And, our thoughts are with the community, especially at this very difficult time.
Thank you so much, Mary.